Okay, I think we'll begin. We'd like to welcome you to this session on addressing freedom of religion or belief at the G20 level. We're very grateful for those of you who are with us here, but also for those who are joining with the streaming audience, and this session will also be recorded. We are competing with the civil society session of the ministerial, and so we're conscious that our numbers in this room at this moment are a little thin, but we understand that we'll be able to share this online with other people. So we're again grateful to welcome you here. We will have in this session we'll have a series of speakers. I'll be saying a few things by word of introduction. My name is Durham. I'm the director of the, I'm the president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association and the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. We'll then hear from Katherine Marshall, who's the vice president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. She's also the senior fellow at the Berkley Center at Georgetown University and is executive director of the World Faith Development Dialogue and has extensive experience in the field of religion and development. We're very grateful to have her with us. And then joining us remotely from New York is Audrey Kitagawa, who is the president and founder of the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation. She is also a member of the Advisory Council for the International Academy, for the International G20 Internet. These terms all run together, so the G20 Interfaith Forum. And she is the co-chair, she's been the chair of our anti-racism initiative, and she's the co-chair of the Gender and Equality Working Group. So we're grateful for all that she is doing. Then we will have hear from Rawaad Mahyub, who is the director of ACWAY, a common word among the youth, that is an organization that has been our partner for several years as the youth partner for the G20 Interfaith, and we're very grateful to have them with us. And they have two of their ACWAY fellows, Riley Anderson and Parth Bhansali, who are with us as well, and they'll be doing a presentation a little later. So let me just say a few words by introduction, and then we'll turn things over to others. In some ways, one could start out by asking, what is the connection between FoRB, that is freedom of religion or belief, and the G20 Interfaith and the G20 Summit? I suppose you can think of this as a two-step kind of analysis. First of all, most people understand that the G20 process itself tends to focus heavily on economics and finance, but that's because it really grew out of and really came into its own after the 2008 crash. But over the years, there's been an increasing tendency as each host country chooses what it would like to emphasize, what its priorities are. There's been a real tendency over the past decade, really, to add in focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And those goals include a broad range of issues on which religious communities have a tremendous amount of input. If you think about the SDGs, number one, poverty; number two, zero hunger; number three, health; number four, education. Several of the SDGs focus on environment. All of these issues are things that religious communities are very highly focused on, highly motivated to deal with, and they make, and it's really impossible to imagine the SDGs being achieved at anywhere near an optimal level without coordinating with the religious communities. And yet there is the religious communities tend to be overlooked in the policy-making world. I think that's changing, and part of our role is to work on helping that change to happen and happen more effectively. So that the first step is recognizing the importance of religion to the SDGs and therefore to the overall focus of the G20. The second step is that those religious communities cannot really function at optimal levels if they don't have freedom of religion or belief functioning in their societies. In some ways this is obvious. If they're spending a lot of time protecting themselves from persecution or from discrimination, that means they have less time and resources free to work on other areas where they can be making positive contributions. So the reality is that freedom of religion is vital for the other kinds of things that the G20 is focused on, and we need to, in this context, really highlight that area. One of the things that's striking is that the freedom of religion or belief tends to be underestimated as a factor that really ought to be taken into account. At the G20 Interfaith Forum, we have for years had a working group that deals with freedom of religion or belief and the G20, and we have organized its work under SDG 16, which relates to peace, justice, and strong institutions. And it's always seemed clear to us that without positive involvement with religious communities, it would be much harder to achieve those things, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I did a paper recently, and one of the striking things to me is that when you look at the measuring tools, the targets and the indicators, there's practically no reference to religion in trying to bring about the peace, justice, and strong institutions. Now, this is a reflection in part of the fact that religion makes a lot of political leaders nervous. They don't know all the ways to deal with that, but that's actually a problem, that they're not seeing things in a more important way. We've seen this on a lot of fronts, and I'll just mention some very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to other panelists. For example, we recently posted a blog on our website by Alison Ussery dealing with trafficking, and I encourage you to look at that study. It focuses on what's happening in Ukraine and the problems of trafficking that are emerging. There's an urgent need for attention to that area. Another, the food crisis that's impending, again, in part because of Ukraine, and the fact that foodstuffs and wheat supplies and other things are being held up there. That's a real problem. As a practical matter, one of the things we're doing as the G20 Interfaith Forum is that in addition to organizing larger events with each host country, we are working harder to reach out and make connections with various other G20 countries. One of the things we've learned is that the host countries are typically so busy that it's hard to really get them to focus, and yet some of these issues are so important that we can work with many of our other partners who are increasingly sensitive to these religion-focused areas. So let me not take more time now, but just re-emphasize the increasing importance that is recognized in the world of policy making, but also the need to strengthen people's understanding of the importance of this sector. With that, let me turn time over to Katherine Marshall, again, from the Berkley Center. Thank you.
I think the central issue that we're dealing with in linking issues around religious freedom to these very broad global agendas, which is the basic challenge for the G20, also though the G7, which has been meeting, I think it's still meeting now in Germany, you could even look to the United Nations, is the challenge of making this relevant, a priority, practical. And those, I think, are issues that we're grappling with in the G20 Interfaith Forum. And it does bring us to three very related issues. The first one clearly is religious freedom, which is the focus of the meetings here today. But if you look at it more broadly, you can call it religious engagement. So it is basically the ways in which this vast, complicated world of religious institutions relates to what we call the global agendas: environment, refugees, water, women's empowerment, etc. And that brings us often up against the issues of religious literacy, but also what I would call development literacy. In other words, how are these linked, often overlapping constituencies communicating with each other? So I'm going to focus on 7 points and end with what I see as some of the good news and some of the less good news. The first one is that I think it's important to recognize that there's considerable tension, let's just say now, between the religious freedom approaches and religious engagement approaches, and a lot of debate as to where the lines are. Where do you start? At some crude level, religious engagement is positive. It's reaching out, it's having relationships, it's what Chris Seipel calls covenantal pluralism, the kinds of dialogue that really mean that even technical specialists, dam construction engineers, would want and need to have some grasp of how the religious communities are seeing the issues that they're dealing with. That's sort of the religious engagement in a positive sense. And the danger with religious freedom is that it can become quite negative, that a lot of the focus is on violations. And so you have these two communities, which we saw quite visibly in debates around how the U.S. State Department would organize its religious outreach work, that the two of them have found it somewhat difficult to figure out where the engagement is. The second issue is a little bit broader, and I heard it mentioned in the plenary, is some tensions, real tensions, but also real disconnects between the worlds and the constituencies, the advocacy groups for human rights and those for religious freedom, which at one level makes absolutely no sense because, of course, religious freedom is core human right, one of the 4 freedoms. It's historically, actually, at so many different levels, they go together. And yet, the way that the constituencies have emerged in many places, they see themselves some tension. And it means that the religious freedom is a little bit defensive about the priority and the importance of religious freedom issues versus the human rights, which doesn't quite know how to deal with the religious freedom. And I would also add that you see that more broadly, that even we're talking now about a civil society forum. And in many countries, including, I think, the United States, there's some real question as to how does religion fit into civil society. And in many places, if you actually included the religious institutions and actors in civil society, they would drown the rest of the NGOs and others. And so there's another sort of tension. So that's the second. The third is that we have heard for many years, I've been working on these issues as a priority and so forth for over 20 years, about 22, 23 years now. And a constant refrain has been that there isn't enough evidence, that we don't know what do religious groups do, and there's a general sense, frankly, that the quality of some of the religious engagement work on water, on orphans, that's a big problem, and other issues is not at the same level, isn't fully in tune with the best practice. So is there enough evidence? We think that that's actually a non-issue. There's huge amount of issues. One of the complexities, though, is that it's in at least 13 disciplines. So anthropology, psychology, religious studies, you name it, political science, economics, etc. And it's therefore often not easy, and it is lopsided, so that it's heavily focused on Anglophone, it's heavily focused on Africa, Christianity, very heavily focused on Christianity. So we did a very thorough review of this evidence as part of a team for the US aid 2 years ago, and those were some of the findings, that there's been an explosion of evidence that this sort of we don't have the evidence is not a meaningful critique, but it's not easy to get hold of, and it is uneven. A fourth issue that's an interesting one in the relationships between many religious institutions and development institutions is that there is this constant nagging preoccupation with instrumentalization, which basically means that the religious communities feel that they're being used, or that they're only being brought in when there's a food crisis in Yemen, for example. At the very last minute, they're not part of the design and thinking. And you could see that as vice versa as well. But again, I think that there's an overstatement of that issue. But it does mean that seeing how in the policy processes as well as in the programs at the field level, how do you link these? A fifth issue is that the data on religion is horribly complex. And there are some numbers that are widely used, often in not very helpful ways. Just to cite two, 84% of the world's population, according to Pew, has some kind of religious affiliation. So what does that mean? That somebody says, are you Muslim? I mean, in the data, every Catholic, everyone who's been baptized as a Catholic counts as a Catholic by some counts. And we know that they aren't all perfectly in tune. So that's another issue, the issues of what does it actually mean. And you hear people actually misquote that number, saying 84% of people believe in God, which really is not what the figure says at all. It's about identity, it's not about belief, and so forth. And then 83% of people live in countries where there are violations of religious freedom. I mean, again, that's a problematic number. So, but all these numbers, you know, how important is religion to you? Measures of religiosity are very difficult for people to get their minds around. What am I supposed to do with that number? You know, Senegal is one of the most religiously, has the highest indices in the world. So we're doing programs in Senegal. What does that mean, apart from obviously talking to people? So that the seventh issue, which Cole alluded to, is that a lot of the basic debates around global agendas turn on economics. And a lot of people who are working in the religious communities are quite uncomfortable with that. They don't quite know how to grasp that. I remember in dialogue with the World Council of Churches, everybody who introduced themselves at meetings said with both fear and pride, I am not an economist. But we need to find better ways to have this engagement, because the policy framework and these systems are what's driving. And it's part of what people are so concerned about with greed, materialism, corruption. All of those issues come back to economic incentives and systems. So we need to deal with that. And then the seventh is simply a reminder that these religious issues are hugely complex, very dynamic, and very sensitive, that people often approach discussions about religion not necessarily with their intellect, but with their own beliefs and their own strongly held views. So finding better ways to make this not objective, well, objective is not a bad thing, is it? But at least using numbers, using solid evidence, being open. And this openness and listening is clearly a very critical issue on all sides. But it's, when I was in the World Bank for many years, and I know that for many years it was very rare to hear religion mentioned. I've been in probably discussions of 50, 60 country strategy discussions. Never, not once, was there an issue around religious freedom. But in the discussions about people's concerns, you had politics. You have tremendous concern about proselytization. It surprised us because every corner of the world, there are very strongly held views about people coming in and trying to get people to change their religion, even though that's part of FoRB, of course. And then there are huge issues around gender that we absolutely have to recognize. Every time there's an all-male panel, and happily this is not one, we call them a manel, that every time there's one all over the internet, there are pictures of that panel. And the basic message is, why should we care or listen to these people if they are focused, if they can't deal with women, 50% of the population? So, or they deal with it in trite ways. I mean, even Pope Francis, who's obviously a great leader, is subject to many criticisms on that. So just to finish with some of the good news, over the past 22 years, there's been a sharp increase in focus, attention, research. There's also, I think, been more openness, more awareness. There have been a lot of initiatives, Norway, Switzerland, the UK, Denmark, many other countries have really looked pretty systematically at how should we be taking more account of the religious dimensions. But the negative side of that is that a lot of it is stop-start. The leader leaves and their successor wants nothing to do with it or just ignores it. I've seen that in the World Bank, which I know very well, 2 or 3 times. The other is that there was a sharp change in 9/11, and the issues of security and extremism and violence tend to color many of the other dimensions of thinking about religious engagement. There is very much, and if you don't start with religion as part of the problem and part of the solution, you've lost a large part of your audience because many people start with that frame of mind and that assumption. So only emphasizing the positive will not get us very far. We need to deal with, for example, vaccine hesitancy and resistance, misinformation, hate speech, some of the discrimination that's come out of the COVID pandemic. All of those are very real issues that need to be dealt with in complex, context-specific ways.
So, thank you, Katherine. It's always a pleasure to hear from Katherine, and with her great knowledge of what's happening and also her ability to reduce it to a number of practical points that really require thinking and thinking about. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Audrey, who is joining us from New York today. But thank you, Audrey, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cole, and good afternoon, everyone. It is such a privilege to be able to share within this International Religious Freedom Summit about the work of the G20 Interfaith Forum, or IF20 for short, and its anti-racism initiative. The IF20 is an international platform where religiously linked institutions and initiatives engage on global agendas which have relevance to the Sustainable Development Goals, as Katherine has indicated. The annual G20 summits present an opportunity to address critical global issues. And the goal of the IF20 is to contribute meaningful insight that provide policy recommendations to the G20 global policy agendas. And the IF20 builds on the significant roles that religious institutions and beliefs play in world affairs, reflecting their rich diversity of institutions, ideas, and values. And these include interfaith and intercultural organizations, and also religious leaders, scholars, and the business and civil society actors, and humanitarian entities. And the G20 Interfaith Forum focuses on these 4 areas. One is it explores the links between economic development and religious freedom through informed scholarly discussion. And this is one of the areas that Katherine also addressed. 2, facilitates constructive dialogue between societal leaders in faith, government, business, media, education, and other social institutions, and examines how interfaith resources can enhance social, economic, and cultural policies and programs for the well-being of all. And 3, fosters communication channels between the different faiths through the sharing of ideas, experiences, and best practices in building peace and harmony. And 4, identifies and affirms common values, virtues, and principles among diverse faith and philosophic traditions. Within the House of IF20, the work of the Anti-Racism Initiative informs, educates, and advocates about the structural, systemic, and institutional forms of racism in all of its many manifestations. Racism is a problem with a long, painful, and complex history. While much work has been done by many institutions, from leading guiding institutions such as the United Nations and faith-based and civil society organizations, UNESCO, and governments, that have addressed this issue, racism unfortunately still remains a deeply ingrained, substantial, and systemic problem on many levels. And the Statement of Principles on Eliminating Racism in All Its Forms, which the Anti-Racism Initiative of the IF20 issued in August of 2020, indicates that the IF20 provides a regular platform for religious voices to engage with the G20 process in framing global policy initiatives. And our mandate obliges us to bring faith and public policies together. The exercise of that mandate demands a recognition that racism, far from an isolated issue, infects every aspect of human endeavor and planetary existence. The IF20 Anti-Racism Initiative's mandate is to remain sensitive to the impact of racism as a cross-cutting issue for IF20 and G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 to work towards the eradication of racism and towards advancing the goal of racial equality and equity by every means available. The Anti-Racism Initiative has taken its mandate very seriously and has sought to bring awareness, education, and advocacy through its monthly webinars that have dealt with racism against the Indigenous people, anti-Asian hate crimes, systemic racial challenges against Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, Black Lives Matter and the structural racism and issues of inclusion and exclusion, racism in the media, manufacturing hate, ecological racism, and the deep sea mining of the Pacific, education and assimilation, and the lasting consequences of Indian boarding schools in Canada and the US, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and our webinar yesterday on what the Pope's visit to Canada means for Indigenous residential school survivors. We will be issuing future webinars on Hinduism and religious literacy, apartheid and globalization, racism in religion, and covering a host of other ways in which racism is made manifest. The Anti-Racism Initiative will continue to provide educational materials and will seek to expand its outreach into other formats, including films, books, magazines, and maximization of its social media platforms. In 1963, United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which solemnly affirms the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and securing understanding of and respect for the dignity of human persons, convinced that the doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory and in practice anywhere. The Anti-Racism Initiative affirms its commitment to and support of all international instruments outlawing racism in all its forms. These include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, among others. We also call attention to the United Nations Strategy and Plan on Hate Speech in response to the growing xenophobia, racism, and intolerance, violent misogyny, anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim hatred around the world. And as again, Katherine pointed out, this aspect of not having gender equality is a very important aspect to examine. People are never to be commodified or instrumentalized, but cherished. And as people of faith, we affirm the precious worth of every life as an obvious consequence of divine love and compassion. While we recognize the day-to-day impact of individual acts of racism, the G20 processes offer the potential to engage systemic and structural racism with a view to bold action. This deserves an explicit priority because of racism's grave social, ethical, economic, legal, political, and religious and spiritual impacts. The wide and interconnected impact of racism and racial prejudice for all sustainable development goals and targets, as well as the multifaceted COVID-19 emergencies, argues for action by the G20 to take on racism as a central and continuing agenda focus. The IF20, through its anti-racism initiative and its other policy work, is committed to confronting racism in all of its forms with the aspiration of supporting actions that eradicate it. Healing, reconciliation, and equity are unachievable without attending to that goal. And in 1921, the G20 Interfaith Forum made a policy recommendation to establish a solid analytic foundation for continuing action with a call for the G20 to establish an international commission on racism. And the goals of such a commission would be: one, to give central prominence to an underlying issue that in differing forms affects each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in both national and international relations, and to task the G20 leaders with responsibility to act. Two, to assemble a tightly organized, multidisciplinary group of respected statespeople, scholars, interreligious leaders, and experts for gathering the considerable collective wisdom that exists on positive action paths. Three, to set out in a widely promulgated document specific principles and proposals that will spur appropriate and urgent action. Such action could include removing racist language and racist legislation that may still exist or be promoted, as well as developing anti-racist legislation. It is a common thread that if root causes are left unaddressed, they threaten the legitimacy of the international order and can lead to civil unrest on a massive scale. We must see how racist practices influence policies and structures that undermine international cooperation in vaccine distribution, food security, and climate mitigation and adaptation. The Antidote for Racism is to accept and embrace the full humanity of every person. And this includes the sacredness of human conscience and the full dignity and access to all human rights, which are inherent in the world's religious and spiritual traditions. These religious attributes require legal protection and promotion to achieve a culture of respect for human beings. To achieve peace among cultures and peace among religions, it is our conviction that the scourge of racism must be addressed. While a commission of inquiry's findings and recommendations are not binding, they can significantly influence public opinion and promote healing. And may we, in the work that we do, be a force to help with healing, compassion, kindness, and love, which all of our religious traditions call upon us to do daily in our commitment to serve others selflessly. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Audrey, very much for those remarks and the reminders to us of the significance of combating racism. This initiative arose within our organization as a result of concerns that surfaced after the Floyd killing, which brought this to everyone's attention in the United States. But one of the things we realized as we started thinking more deeply about this is that it's truly a cross-cutting issue. We have a number of working groups focusing on different recurring issues, but this one seems to cut across all kinds of issues. And of course, as religious groups have, and in the freedom of religion or belief context, have suffered discrimination, they should be in a position to be uniquely placed to care about and address these kind of issues. As in so many areas, the record of religious groups in this area can be mixed, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't address it and take it seriously and use the voices we have to remind people of dealing with this challenge. So thank you to Audrey for the extraordinary work she's done within our organization and for drawing our attention to these things and help us think more deeply. I'm now going to turn to Rawaad Mahyub, who is the director of ACWAY, which, as I indicated, is the youth partner for the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. We're very thankful for their work. And in this area, as in so many areas, what's really vital is engaging youth on these issues. I often point out that every 10 years you have a new cohort that needs, and it's like a constant refrain, a constant issue, and yet so much on so many fronts about the future really depends and affects the young people. So let me turn things to Rawaad, and you can say a little bit more about the two fellows from your organization.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you very much. Well, in the spirit of the theme of this summit, freedom of religion and belief, let me greet you with a universal greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace and blessings be upon us all, those in the room and those joining us online. And of course, I'd like to thank the organizers and our partners in putting this together, the G20 Interfaith Forum, BYU, and our supporters over the years, the Sterling Foundation, led by Ed Rowe and his team. So thank you to Sterling Foundation. And I'm glad that our chairman, Dr. Brian Adams, chairman of Right Star Foundation, has joined us as well today. He's also the co-founder of the G20 Interfaith Forum. So thank you to our partners and supporters. So today I'm going to do two things really quickly. One is introduce you to ACWAY, for those who are not familiar who ACWAY is, a common word among the youth. And then I'll briefly introduce a flagship initiative in the last couple of minutes. And I'm glad and honored to be joined by two of our younger fellows, Riley and Parth, who will share their stories and experiences with you. ACWAY is a global youth movement. We have about 180 young people from approximately 85 countries who have delivered approximately 200 activities from around the world, interfaith, interreligious, intercultural, community activities in their countries. So ACWAY is about bringing young people together. It's about three things, or three sort of key objectives. We try to bring young people together from around the world. And the objective behind that is to really, more than just bring them together to a particular country and have a nice time, eat great food and do some touristy visits. It's about making the connections that last beyond the conference or the training. And we have fellows, we have young people who are on our executive committee, who are volunteers, who've been with us since 2015 in our first forum. So really, ACWAY is about bringing young people from different communities, different religions and backgrounds, to make the connections, to share experiences and their stories. And we provide them some, what I would call soft training on dialogue, conflict resolution, and also how to deliver and plan their local activity. And that brings me to the second objective, and that is supporting the young people from around the world to not just be part of the interfaith sector and have a voice, but also to deliver these local activities. So we provide them training on planning, on executing, on reporting, as well as then we follow them up and support them after their activity. And then often we offer some small grants for those who need some support to deliver their activity. And the third objective is to, as we are doing today, is to provide them with a platform to share their voices, to share their experiences and their stories in the interfaith sector. Because one of the reasons we launched ACWAY is we felt that there was not many young people at the table. There was not many young people in the audience, or let alone at the table itself. So we wanted to provide those opportunities for young people to be present for the present, not just for the future. And so let me come to the last part of in the last 2 minutes of the presentation. I would like to share with you the flagship initiative, the Interfaith Development Goals. And both Cole and Katherine referenced the IDGs, or rather the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we felt with the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a small gap missing. And if our technical team can share the IDGs. So SDG 16, the Sustainable Development Goal 16, refers to peace and strong institutions and justice. But largely to do with, I would say, heavily politicized and security rather than referencing anything to do with the work that happens in the interfaith or interreligious sector. So we felt that, there's a big gap there where we need to capture the work that happens in building peace and peaceful societies within the interfaith and interreligious sector and to acknowledge that. So we set up the Interfaith Development Goals. There are 10 goals there on the screen, as you can see. And about 5 or 6 of those actually also touch on some of the sustainable development goals of the UN. And in reference to the theme of freedom of religion and belief, there are about 3 of these IDGs, IDG 3, 9, and 10, that relate to the theme of this summit in terms of freedom of religion and belief. And so again, as Katherine said, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of capturing the quality and the evidence of the work that we do. And what we're proposing here with the IDGs is that the interfaith sector, the interreligious sector, use these IDGs to capture, to monitor and assess the work that we do in the sector. And hopefully that'll go a long way to the work we do being more collaborative and more coordinated, and then being able to share that data. Not that we need to, because there's a lot of good work, and as we said, it's quite evident. But at least it helps us to share the experiences and the great work that happens in the sector. I have a question for you, and this is going to be a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to ask those in the audience, you can take part as well online, but unfortunately you won't be able to see your responses or your hands up. So I'm going to ask those in the audience to put their hand up. You can have a minute or so to read the IDGs. So the first one is strong interfaith cooperation, peace through dialogue, universal freedom and security of religion, intergenerational engagement, protection of women's dignity and rights, access to interfaith education and religious literacy, cooperation with non-religious actors, religion as a tool for peace, recognition and protection of religious and ethnic minorities and vulnerable groups, and number 10, respect for religious, faith and spiritual symbols and places. And you'll have, those who are in the audience, you'll have a document here near you somewhere. If you're sitting in the back, you might need to move to the front. But it outlines the IDGs here. So here's the question, here's the challenge. It's a competition, and there's only one prize, so let's see if we can get one winner. So if you can put your hand up, if the work that you do contributes to at least one of these IDGs. So put your hand up and keep your hand up if the work that you do contributes to at least one of these IDGs. Okay? Right. That's everybody, I think. Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if the work you do contributes to 3 of these IDGs. Okay. A couple of hands down. To 5 of these IDGs. Keep your hand up. We'll see who's got last man or last woman standing. So 5 IDGs, the work that you do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 7. All right. To 7 IDGs, 7 of these IDGs. We've got 4, we're down to 4. Okay. All right. So hands up. Oh, we've got somebody here as well. I forgot about you, Cole. So here's a big one. The work that you do contributes to all 10 IDGs. Anybody in the room whose work contributes to all 10? 5, 6. Oh my God, okay. So we've got 6 and we've got only 1 prize, so unfortunately I won't be able to dish that out, but I might find one of you later. All right, so thank you for that. Again, we're calling on partners, those working in the sector to potentially adopt these IDGs, and if you'd like to find out more information, happy to talk to you after this, and also online through our email contact details. And with that, I'll pass you on to our young fellows, and I'll hand it over to Riley, and she can introduce herself as well, and then after that to Parth to share their stories and their ACWAY activities they've done since attending a ACWAY forum. Over to you, Riley.
Yeah. Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody. As you know, I'm Riley Anderson. I'm a current undergrad at University of Rochester. I'm an international relations major, so that's what I do outside of ACWAY. Spend most of my time as a student. I like to say that I've been an active interfaith participant my whole life, but more so as an organization for the last 4 years. Today, I wanted to speak a little bit about things that I've done with ACWAY, and then an experience that I thought related to the theme of why we're here today. This past September, I was able to attend the Interfaith G20. It was a really great opportunity where I got to learn so much about interfaith that I've never been able to learn about before from different sectors of life and in different political sectors, and it was a great opportunity, and I decided to go home to my campus and run an interfaith activity to introduce interfaith to other students on my campus. We had about 45 students attend the event, and we planned on 10 because that's all the university was getting since COVID and stuff, but we had a lot of students who had a lot of interest. And I think that spoke volumes about how the campus was kind of missing that interfaith, but there was so much diversity, and there was just that gap, and I wanted to wedge that a little bit and create a sector between these clubs of different faiths to be able to connect and build a relationship with one another. And we did a speed faithing activity. If you don't know what that is, it's basically speed dating, but with interfaith questions. And each question just got more deeper and deeper and challenged you to be vulnerable to a stranger and have a good conversation. And it was very successful, and I very much enjoyed it. And for the second part of what I wanted to speak about today was about an opportunity I had a couple years ago. In 2019, I had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem with an organization called Youth Summit Jerusalem, and they were partnered with Kids for Peace. On this trip, I was able to go sightseeing and most importantly, spent a lot of time with local youth that were about my age. So I was in high school, so kids between 16 and 18 years old. And we got to spend time just learning about each other's beliefs. We were all from different backgrounds, different religions, and had different walks of life, essentially. And we got to learn leadership skills and just learn about everyday lives. We did various activities. And one of the activities I wanted to share today was one our trip leader organized for us. He set down a passport and then a Bible, and then he was like, whatever religious book you want to call it, and then a picture. And he would ask a question and would ask us to move to which part that we think our belief stands from. So if he asked the question, I thought, well, I feel like this is from me, not my nationality. This is not from my religion. I feel like I pulled this belief. And I would go stand next to the picture frame, vice versa for all the questions. It was a really great way to show us how intertwined all of our lives are. Our nationalities, our religion, and our beings, are just ourselves, are just super interconnected. And it also gave us an opportunity to see how similar we all are and notice where we all kind of stand in life and our differences. And I think differences are just as important as similarities to learn from each other. And I think that set us up for a great opportunity. So we had the chance to go to the Dome of the Rock, where we got to meet the Sheikh, who is kind of the leader of the region. And we got to ask him questions, and he kind of was telling us about how important peace was to him and how he hopes that one day his people can experience that. As we left, we walked around, and one of the local youths was telling us about how important the Dome of the Rock is to him. And he goes, and I'm paraphrasing, so don't quote me directly. He goes, because if we lose this spot, we lose everything. And he was talking about the war and how it's impacted him, and that if they were to lose the Dome of the Rock, he would feel as though he lost himself, his religion, and his nationality. This is where that activity kind of settled in and really showed me how intertwined we really are. And this is where I think freedom of religion comes in specifically. For an example, here in the United States, we have separation of church and state. I think it's so no one has to compromise or give up oneself or their religion or their nationality to be at peace, that they could be all those things at once. Freedom to practice as you believe, wherever that belief stems from, is important because everyone deserves to know that everlasting peace. And as an interfaith advocate, I think it's important to strive to help others feel welcomed and safe, and most importantly, with peace of themselves, their religion, and their nationality. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Parth Bhansali. Also, great job, Riley, in sharing some of that. I did not know a lot of that. So I'd like to first thank everyone for the privilege to be here. And these conferences get long, so I know some of us are starting to fall asleep, so appreciate you sticking there and working with us on this. Like I said, I'm Parth Bhansali. I am a senior regional sales manager at a e-commerce company. I'm a realtor, and then most importantly, I'm an ACWAY fellow, and I'm really proud to say that. Freedom of religion and belief has really been something that has stemmed into the activities and work I've done as an ACWAY fellow. Since G20 Interfaith in Bologna came back and referring to the religious literacy that Professor Cole was talking about, I was a part of a healing and belonging dinner dialogue in Chicago, which is my home city, with another ACWAY fellow. And what we did is we talked about various community efforts, our spaces, and Chicago being as diverse as it is, there's a lot of segregation, right? There's like the Hispanic area, there's the Indian area, and so on. And we brought people from different parts of the city to share that and to be like, this is what my home looks like. This is what my faith space looks like. And in that process, I actually learned that there's a mosque down the street from me that I never knew existed. And that happened because of just talking, right? And getting to know each other. DEI is obviously a major focus in both corporate America and a lot of the major industries right now that are major stakeholders in what's going on. A quick anecdote I wanted to share about that. So 8 years ago when I started at my company, I remember getting the job offer and calling my friends and family and saying, oh my gosh, they have a game room. I can go play ping pong during lunch, right? And it was like the most exciting thing ever. And now I'm hearing from my friends who are starting at new companies, oh my gosh, I can take Hanukkah off. They have a DEI team. This is amazing, right? And the focus has shifted. And that comes from exactly what we're here for, freedom of religion and belief. With that, the major groups that are requesting this, those stakeholders, they're the ones who are making the decisions that are then like filtering out, right? So if a major company is like, you know what, instead of giving a like Christmas off, we're gonna offer a floating holiday, and that will come down to smaller companies and organizations. And then that from there goes to different ideas, and that's where everything's kind of like creates and right and comes from. One of the major groups that is a part of that conversation are youth, and we're missing that voice. Because usually the youth don't have the opportunity to connect with those decision makers. And that's where ACWAY has really given me the opportunity to be a part of that as well. I know with time, I just want to share one more quick story. ACWAY is incredible for many reasons, but the biggest reason is the network and the family we've created, right? All the ACWAY fellows that Rawaad was talking about, we're still in touch. And that's obviously due to technology has made that a lot easier. But recently, so my family's from India, and there was another ACWAY fellow that's Indian who works with the Hindus for Human Rights, and he sent an email to me as a Hindu and another ACWAY fellow who's a Muslim, and said, there's some not good stuff going on right now between our two faiths out there in the world. And so I have an idea. And that's where we're in like initial phases, right? But it stemmed from that to now let's run a camp for youth who are of both faiths and just equip them with the knowledge of like, hey, mom and dad, hey, uncle and aunt, hey, grandma, grandpa, this is why that other faith is actually not bad. This is where that misinformation, right? All this other stuff, that's where like we can help build those bridges and gaps. And all I ask for, if there's anything from me that you take today, is let's give the youth a voice. So thank you for having us.
So thank you very much for that perspective. I'm watching the clock, and we've got minders from the overall organization that we have to stay on time. But I think we have time. We could take a question from the audience if there is any. Yeah, Katrina. What I do, let me just ask, do we need to get this on a microphone so it gets connected? Why don't we assume that it does? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Katrina Lantos-Sweat, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the summit, so I'm really excited to attend this event. And I have a question in particular for the two young participants in ACWAY who just spoke. I was not familiar with your organization. It sounds like a really great group. I, among other things, teach a course on international religious freedom at Tufts University. And one of the things I have found, and I'm curious if this has been your experience as well, is that there is simultaneously a kind of dismissal of the role of faith in the life of young people, accompanied by a real hunger for it. And it's always been just a really intriguing thing for me to see my students at the beginning of the semester and then at the end of the semester. At the beginning of the semester, most of them are completely uncomfortable with and kind of unfamiliar with much of the language around faith communities and the issues involved with defending international religious freedom or building interfaith dialogue. And they really come alive to it. And many of them have stayed in touch with me to say that just having a course that, yes, from an academic perspective, but also sort of from a heart perspective, opened them up to this world was really a meaningful thing for them. And so I'm just curious, among your peers, do you find that same dichotomy? On the one hand, we have no interest in the world of faith in our lives. On the other hand, we're kind of hungry for it.
Well, let's go ahead and take this.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of my perspective, and then if Parth wants to share. So I've done a lot of work with college students, as you can tell, as a college student. In high school, I worked for Utah Valley University's Interfaith Council. So I worked directly with their council, working with youth who were very much one religion and very much not. And I dealt with a lot of religious trauma as well, hearing people's stories about how they're either left their religion, or they're trying to find a new religion, or they're perfectly comfortable with where they're at. And it was very eye-opening for a high schooler who was talking to these college students and listening to how they're adjusting to life. And I found it so important to give them that space to talk, even if they didn't want anything to do with an organized religion. We made it so it was comfortable for people who consider themselves atheists or agnostic to come and just speak and just talk about their beliefs and connect with other people and feel as though they're heard and understood. And so I do understand what you're saying with that disconnect and that hunger. And I think for the majority of my personal experience that everyone I've met, the more they talk about it, the more they become interested. And I think you just have to give them the opportunity to learn about it. And because regardless if they're religious or not, I think having a space for people to talk to their peers comfortably is super important, especially in a time period where you're on your own for the first time and your parents aren't telling you everything anymore, and you're really having to make those own decisions. So I think it's wonderful that your kids and your class tend to love it more throughout the semester, but I do feel like in my personal experience there is that disconnect. But the more it's readily available to them, I think the more they connect, for sure.
Well, unfortunately, we're really close to the end of time. I've just got the red flag. I take it that means we're close to the end. But I think we could probably just take a minute if any of our people want to take short 30-second final statements. You can, yes, no, Katherine?
I think the efforts to bring together these somewhat divided areas, particularly in our divided society with the culture wars, is the priority, and that includes the broader understanding of religious engagement and the religious freedom and the passions behind them, but also between the human rights community and the religious freedom. It's the fact that they're so apart, but also with a whole set of complex implicit tensions, does cry out for some real bridge building.
I'll hand my 30 seconds to one of the young people. Over to you.
Well, thank you for that. So what I'll say, very, very great question. Thank you for asking for it. The biggest part of this is feeling comfortable. I mean, I think a huge piece of it also is like generationally, we've been taught by our parents and grandparents, do not talk about politics and what? Religion, right? And so that's kind of like what's been kind of put into our head. And the more I talked about it, I had a professor very similar to you who's very dear to me, who got me into interfaith work, and it was because she made and created a space for that. So just please continue doing that. And lastly, just when we talk about faith and youth, create that space of just being able to discuss things that are not necessarily like traditional. So it's okay to go, you don't have to become a priest to go into faith-based work. You can become someone who owns a business. I want to be a CEO one day, that's my dream. I can do that and still be an interfaith leader, right? And I think we need to create that environment. So thank you.
So Audrey, would you, final point?
You know, our different perspectives that are fashioned out of our life experiences and our own enculturation can create points of divide, as Katherine had mentioned. But it's very important for all of us to remember that we should practice our respective faith traditions and to honor the values that they call to us to implement every day that we live. And that is ultimately to have that compassion, kindness, love, and caring for each other, and to serve each other selflessly. So thank you so much.
So I guess what I would say is I'm increasingly conscious that we face overwhelming problems. I've been hearing the last week or so that the number of refugees has passed the 100 million mark, which is really frightening because it was about 80 million last time I checked. The food crisis that's impending, what we've been through with the pandemic and what is likely to come sooner or later in that front, just the problems of war, what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, it seems to be insoluble. All of these things are huge problems, and I think we don't know what's going to happen with the G20, frankly. I mean, after all, if Indonesia invites Russia, then the United States may not attend. Maybe that'll trigger Germany, Italy, UK not attending, so what happens? But the reality is the G20 represents something like 80% of the world's economic output, And economics and material solutions are not the only solutions, but they certainly can't be ignored. And I think if we can find ways to build partnership, engagement, this is a kind of forum and platform that works not only in terms of reaching the leaders, but also by bringing religious actors together who often can solve problems that the political leaders, the economic leaders themselves can't solve, or that they can contribute to problems being solved better. They're huge problems, huge complexities, but I think this is why this is an ongoing area to sort of address policy issues at this level. So thank you very much for being with us.